Mission is a proud sponsor of this event. We've been a long-standing member of the Chamber, and we're a founding member of WNC DEC because it's such important work for our community. So I'm just happy to be able to share this experience with you, because this is how we get better as a community. We talk about the tough things so that we can continue to grow and learn. So thanks for hosting us, and we're happy to sponsor.
Great. Thank you. Thanks so much, Nancy. And the coordinator of Western North Carolina Diversity Engagement Coalition is Crystal Sheriff. She's here as well. Crystal, you want to say hello?
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming out. Producing this series with Amy has been really great, really wonderful. And I feel like we've had a lot of really great speakers. And I feel like the work and the conversations that are being had are very topical and important. So I'm glad you all are here today. And I'm really glad we have Chelsea here today. I'm gonna let her introduce herself, but I've worked with Chelsea for over a year now, and one of the most competent women I've ever worked with. So I'm very excited for you all to get to experience some of that.
Great. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much. Yes, I do want to introduce Chelsea Herre. She's the operations manager for the Rhubarb and Benne on Eagle. Yes?
Yes, ma'am.
Got it. Okay, just want to make sure I got all three of them. The Rue, not everybody knows about the Rue, and they should, because it's this awesome bakery.
Thank you.
So, Chelsea, the floor is yours.
Marvelous. Welcome all. Thanks so much for having me. And thank you for the kind words, Crystal. It has been, I am Chelsea, and my sort of background, I originally went to school to be an English teacher, and have been working in restaurants since I was about 15. So somewhere along the way, I decided that that was what I wanted to do. So I actually switched my educational path from English literature to human resources, so a BS in business. And throughout that time, just have been working in the food service industry for all of my professional career. So I like to say that I'm in the business of people, both in food service, and that's what we do. We provide hospitality, but also particularly in my role as a human resources manager, which eventually grew into director of operations for John Fleer's restaurants in Asheville. So I started, my focus has always been on my employees. When we are in food service in particular, our focus is on our guests and their experience, but that starts with the people who are delivering that experience, whether it be, worker satisfaction, making sure that we can keep consistency, particularly in such a foodie town like Asheville. Restaurants are sort of the hearth and home of a lot of our tourism industry. So we see a lot of people. And so making people feel welcome, making people feel included, and making sure that the people that we have on our teams who are providing that service feel valued and safe and respected, have always been sort of my main goals as someone who's responsible for about 150 employees. I've always been very proud of the service industry, particularly in my recent career. So I've been working for John Fleer for about 4 years. And in particular, in this new age, there's a lot of professional servers. People can view hospitality as a career, whereas I think a lot of times the thoughts behind it are that they're, 17-year-old kids. And while there's certainly, I was one, there certainly is that there are also a lot of people who make the industry their home and their career. So treating them as professionals and discovering them as professionals, developing them as professionals has always been sort of one of my passions. It's a little bit of that teacher in me, I suppose. But obviously COVID-19 in 2020 shook a lot of that, and really we had to adapt and find new ways to make sure that we were keeping our employees safe, and what to do with those employees when restaurants were completely shut down in Asheville on March 17th. So we went to takeout only on the 17th. So we went from having about 150 employees to having a lot of questions about furlough versus termination, what unemployment benefits were looking like, and how best to protect both our business and our employees at that time. So that's kind of where I wanted to start, was with what happened in our industry, and particularly in my restaurants. I do think that while my knowledge is fairly industry specific, that there are a lot of applications to the aftermath and kind of how the ways that we've had to adapt and become flexible as businesses and as decision makers for our employees. So for us, we are 3 different concepts, and there are about 150 employees, part-time and full-time, when restaurants went to takeout only on March 17th. So we had to make a lot of hard decisions in that first wave of coronavirus. And at that time, unemployment benefits had just started to be raised. So with the CARES Act passing in March as well, most of our employees seemed like they would benefit more from being on unemployment than from working either very, very part-time, which was the only thing on offer at the time. So we terminated all of our hourly employees at the start of the pandemic. And honestly, in those first couple of weeks, keeping up with the DES request was a job in itself. I spent about 17 hours cumulatively on hold with DES, making sure that my hourly employees were able to submit their claims, to responding to that information. Part of it was because the DES model has moved to online. So you're not able to respond to separation requests via mail anymore, which is great for paper reduction, but challenging when you're having hundreds of requests come in a very short period of time. I'm sure many of you are familiar with what happened in North Carolina in particular with DES and just the extreme backlog. I mean, I had some employees that didn't see unemployment benefits until June. But fortunately, we were able to get a lot of our employees that way. And we, being a restaurant, were fortunate that we were able to use a lot of our perishable food items, just streamlined. We did sort of food pickups for employees in the beginning, to do what we could to make sure that there was some food security, even in a time of great uncertainty. And responding to those DES requests was really the utmost importance for us. As a business, there were things that we needed to take care of as we were doing reduced capacity and reduced volume. But the main thing that John Fleer and I focused on was making sure that the employees that we did have knew that we had their back to the extent that we could. We did have several members of our management team, so we went from having about 150 employees to having 10 employees across 3 concepts. But in that time, I will say our communication, I feel like, was probably the most important factor in our relationship with our hourly workers. We kept our schedules active. Our scheduling system has a messaging component, and we kept that active so that we could continue to message with our employees, even though they weren't technically our employees anymore. And that piece of it was very important, I think, was continuing the outreach and the communication, even when a lot of that was uncertainty. We didn't have a lot of answers in the beginning. We all had a lot of questions. And I think that our transparency in that allowed us to continue to show that we were willing to evolve and change and take feedback, and that we wouldn't stop exploring what was best as new information came to light. And that was sort of what we did for the next year, as restaurants sort of were able to open back up again, as we opened up for outdoor dining in May. We started re-onboarding employees. And for us, originally, when this had all happened, we had Rhubarb has been open for almost 8 years, 7.5 years. So at the time, we had some employees that had been with us since the very beginning. So we had some employees that had been there for 6 years. And so originally, the idea was to onboard hourly employees based on seniority, which seemed fair and seemed a way to, to acknowledge the loyalty and sort of encourage the relationships that had been founded. But as we started looking at that, and particularly with the unemployment benefit being the additional $600 from the federal, making so many people's income either similar to or in some cases more than what they were making if they were working part-time, we realized that a lot of our more senior employees were only working part-time originally. So that for us, the seniority model didn't make sense as we started looking at who those employees were and how many hours there were, because our goal in bringing people off of unemployment was to make sure that they had that job security and that pay security, that it didn't seem right to ask people to put themselves more at risk by coming into work and exposing themselves to other employees, to guests, to just the workplace in general during a pandemic, without making sure that their financial needs were at least met or exceeded by what they were being paid. So we sort of changed our model after looking at the first, 5 people who would be called back for seniority, and decided instead to do it by hours worked. This allowed us to offer full-time employment to people who had been full-time employees prior to the pandemic. And we were very fortunate that worked out well for us. It definitely made us able to offer more, again, job security, as well as pay security. So the people that we did bring back, we made sure that we were able to address sort of some of those concerns. In particular in the food and beverage industry, there was a lot of, because so much of the food and beverage front of house in particular is dependent on tips. And then in general, the number of hours, the number of shifts is all dependent on volume. There were a lot of questions in the beginning about how many people would be willing to come out to eat, how much business there would be, and therefore how much work there would be for those employees. So during that time, we just kind of started out slow and started out trying to make sure that that line of communication was open with our hourly employees. We traditionally we had a tip out system where there was a tip share with our support staff, and we changed that model when we started re-onboarding people to make sure that as much of their wages as possible was staying with the employees. And we took on the burden of those hourly employees rather than having them depend on a tip share, which again has some volatility or uncertainty to it since it's based on volume. So those were some of the things that we looked at when we were bringing people back about wage security and making sure that we were able to provide at least what they had been provided, in addition to some certainty while they were on unemployment. So that was sort of the base level of where we started in terms of making sure that the jobs that we were offering were worth people coming back to work in spite of the risks. And then to help mitigate those risks, that is probably the most important part of what we did. And certainly the thing that we spent the most time on. So Count on Me NC, which is a North Carolina-based initiative, they made a really great sort of web-based program in terms of COVID-19, how it spread, how to reduce the spread, cleanliness, and just sort of did a great overview of how best practices for being in the workplace and during the pandemic. So we made that part of our platform. Every single one of our returning employees and any new hires that happened over the next 9 months were all required to take that course, as well as, there's a completion certificate at the end of it. So they're all Count on Me NC certified, which was certainly helpful. Again, sort of giving everyone an overview, as well as setting an expectation for this is something that we're taking seriously. The other part of that, in terms of health and safety, we do require temperature checks for our employees. And we require symptom and exposure checks as well. So before they clock in, and originally when we first started re-onboarding, they went directly through their immediate supervisor. So they went directly to their manager took their temperature, they certified the symptoms, and they signed off on it. It has evolved now as we've gotten more into the rhythm of working, and as we've all as our staff has gotten bigger. So it has become more automated now, where they do it on clock in. So when they clock in, our system actually prompts them for those same symptoms. They have to select no. If they hit yes, I get an alert, so does John. If it asks if they've had an exposure, they have to select no, or else we get a notification, and then they have to type in their temperature. And anything over 99 degrees sends an alert directly to me or John. So we still have those systems in place. They've just sort of streamlined themselves, which has been very helpful. I do think in some ways it has reduced the immediacy, whereas before, when they were checking directly in with the supervisor, there was, they knew it had to be done. It was there, and it was very like, okay, like I need to get my temperature taken before I clock in. And I think in some ways it has reduced the immediacy of the need and the seriousness of it in some ways. But for the most part, we've been very fortunate that most of our employees take it seriously enough to utilize the tools that are there. We did have a small bout of employees who are just putting 98.6 for their temperature every single day. But because it's a report that we're able to look at, it then prompted us to have conversations with those individual employees, just to make sure that they understood that it was for their safety as well as for the safety of the team, that we were performing these checks, and not just to add another layer of things to do before you clock in, or add another layer of bureaucracy to a payroll process. So that has been helpful, I think, in terms of our employees feeling safe, because that was the primary response as we were re-onboarding people and as we were inviting employees back. It was, how do we protect our employees to the best of our abilities? And it weighed pretty heavily. I spent a lot of hours in webinars. I spent a lot of time researching. There have been other businesses that have put out these very comprehensive reopening plans for COVID safety that we utilized as resources as well. But for us, it was really about making sure that we had the proper PPE, which I'm sure many people remember in the early days. Not just the toilet paper running out, because everybody remembers that. But in the early days, masks were not mass produced quite yet. Some companies switched to making them, and then for a while, the only ones you could get were from China, which there were a lot of people, questioning the irony of that. The disposable masks obviously also have a bit of an environmental impact, and with John Fleur's restaurants, we're all about sustainability and the local economy, and so those have always been part of our ethos. So trying to make sure that we can provide reusable masks for employees that maybe don't have them or want more comfortable ones if they hadn't found the right fit yet, because there was definitely a learning curve when it came to masks. For a lot of us, I think I invested pretty heavily once I found one that didn't fog my glasses up. So I have about 7 from the same people, because I can wear them without them fogging up my glasses, which is very useful. But providing that PPE, we also ordered acrylic shields for any of the points of contact for our staff. So at the host stand, when there's the first entrance, so there's an automatic barrier between the host and any guests that are coming in, as well as on our traditional bar area, which we're not currently seating, but we do still have plexiglass shields to sort of discourage people from chatting to our bar staff, or at least keeping them safe if people do decide to chat, as well as our chef's bar, because we do have an open kitchen concept. So there is another, it's an open kitchen. So there's room to communicate with our back of house staff as well. So we ordered a lot of acrylic shields, yes, they're acrylic, but they're big shields, not the kind that go over your face. They're large sheets of acrylic that stand up on the bar and on the host stands. And then, of course, we had EnviroMasters come and do a cleaning. We've installed extra HEPA filters. There's been a lot of focus on health and safety, and I think sometimes particularly in a public facing role, you know, there was a lot of overlap for us about, you know, making sure that guests feel safe as we welcome them back to our restaurants. But that all really started with our employees first, and how do we protect our employees and our people, and then sort of extrapolated out to the people that we were welcoming back into our restaurants. And I think that has been sort of the focus for the last several months of the pandemic, for certain, is that as we as a society have adjusted to, you know, the inherent risks of going outside and the social distancing, wearing a mask, and doing all these things that we know to help reduce the spread, that for our hourly workers, it has been a focus on continuing to uphold those practices, but also just keeping that line of communication open, that if they do have symptoms, they do need to report them, and making sure that we're proactive in that communication about how they will be paid. That, you know, with the CARES Act, they are paid for time away from work while awaiting a diagnosis, and getting away from this mentality that I think a lot of us have of, you know, oh, it's just a cold, I don't need to stay home from work, or, you know, there's long been, particularly in the restaurant industry, but I think in the United States in general, a sort of badge of honor of going to work when you're sick, that, you know, if it's not debilitating, you can work through it. And I think that we've seen this great shift in how that is damaging, and more importantly, that we as a society need to take better care of our hourly workers who maybe don't have paid time off, or sick leave or health insurance, that making sure that they feel safe and that they feel able to say when they do have symptoms, such as a fever or a loss of taste or smell, or any of those things that in a pandemic take on a heightened sense of being debilitating or potentially being debilitating. So for us, it's any of those symptoms, we do not have employees work, and we send them to go and get tested. We have been exceedingly fortunate to have no cases at Rhubarb of employees or the Rue. We did have a case at Benne, but we are also very fortunate in that it was an entire household, unfortunately for us. And fortunately, the entire household recovered, which was great. There was a grandmother involved as well, so it was a fortunate recovery, but we were able to, you know, shut the restaurant down and then clean and then reopen with staff from another restaurant as well. So we've been fortunate in our ability to adapt to those things, but largely I think because of that communication piece and keeping it open between our management staff, our leadership team, and our hourly employees, that yes, it's important that you symptom check, that yes, you will be paid if you do need to miss work, and that, again, your safety and your health and your feeling of comfort at work is paramount to what we do. And again, I think, you know, a lot of that is in the hospitality industry, certainly indicative of what we do. You know, we take care of people, but that employees have not always felt included in that. So that has kind of been our main focus over the last several months, was to make sure that our employees not just feel valued for the work that they do, that's certainly part of it, but also that they feel safe as they can. So that has been my main focus, I think, in taking care of our employees, that it's not necessarily about keeping the business open or keeping, you know, I mean, certainly worker productivity is important. I mean, there's a lot of considerations, of course, with labor, but the pandemic, I think, has been a boon to employer rights or employee rights, and hourly workers in particular, in that it has shifted the focus on the risks that they do take and the sense of appreciation that they should feel, and the amount of safety the amount of attention and finances that should be invested in their safety, that to work is a right that they should have, and to work safely is important. So that has sort of been my experience with COVID and the hourly worker, and that opening ourselves up to feedback, to when people don't feel safe, or if, some of their coworkers aren't wearing their masks appropriately. There's the under the nose mask that we see people doing. And I think that there's been a greater accountability among our staff, which has been really nice, holding each other accountable and saying, like, your mask has fallen off, do you need a different one? Or, oh, I have an extra one if you need it. And making sure that their coworkers have the tools that they need to be safe, as well as to kind of keep the team safe. We've eliminated we've reduced the number of people that can be in service areas. We've spread out our POS systems. And so while we certainly have a different model than, companies that have been able to allow people to work remotely or things like that, I think we've seen a shift overall in the amount of communication between leadership teams and hourly workers because of it. That, particularly if you have remote workers, making sure that those expectations are still clear, that the responsibilities from day to day are still clear. Zoom meetings, of course, have certainly seen, a huge rise. And I think that line of communication and the transparency that we have seen from some businesses has been great. And also, by contrast, it's been sort of a trial by fire for some businesses that haven't had the same transparency. And I think in this wave of employees recognizing, their value and demanding that businesses take ownership of their safety and their quality of life to the extent that they are responsible for it. I think you've also seen that from people as consumers, that, as businesses have either swept COVID under the rug or, not enforced mask mandates or, done things to employees or terminated employees in a way that people didn't feel was appropriate. We've seen the consumer backlash on that, that people have taken to Instagram and social media and to Google's reviews and started to voice those opinions. Whereas before, the hiring practices of a company weren't generally advertised or talked about in public forums, and their cleanliness or their general business practices weren't usually discussed in a consumer forum, like a review forum, in a big way. It was usually, a personal opinion of an experience that was had. But I think that we're seeing that shift of holding businesses accountable for how they treat their employees, particularly during this time. So I think that's been pretty new and, a little scary. That, because we are all learning and evolving and things do change. I mean, we went from 50% capacity from Labor or Memorial Day weekend through January, and then we were at 30% capacity and then back to 50, and had a 9 o'clock curfew, and now it's back to 11. So, I mean, there are constantly changing regulations and not just rules, but also suggested guidelines to follow. The original incubation and quarantine period was 14 days. Now it's 7 to 10. So there is a constant adjustment. And I think that, so it is daunting sometimes to keep up with everything and to feel like you are being proactive rather than reactive. But I do think that there's also a much needed responsibility and accountability on the part of employers to make sure that they are doing the work and doing the research, that it's not an employee's responsibility to say, I'm going to do this to keep myself safe, that it is very much on the responsibility of the employer to say, we will create a safe environment for you. So that's been our focus and been sort of the juggling act. And I think that for the businesses that have been successful at it, it has been this flexibility and adaptability, that to be able to deal with the constant stream of information, and filter it through and put it into decision making, you know, and not just continue to do things the way they have been, or to say that we can't find a different solution because it doesn't work in this business model. You know, Rhubarb never did to-go food before. I mean, we would package things to go, but you couldn't call a restaurant and place a to-go order in the pre-pandemic era. Our menus changed every shift, so we'd ask that you'd come into the restaurant to place an order. But obviously we had to change that thought process and that mentality. And now you can get Rhubarb delivered. And, you know, a lot of, we are certainly not alone in that in any way. I do see a question. Has there been any hesitancy for hourly workers to come back to work? Are you able to hire all the people you need? It's a great question. There was, I think, initially some hesitancy to come back to work for sure. And we saw a lot of it, and I think that's a lot of what drove our safety precautions, was that was the feedback we were getting, that there's an inherent risk, but what's the inherent payoff? And we were fortunate that we had a lot of employees who wanted to come back to work, in particular in those first few months, because it was a sort of a slow roll into reopening, that we were able to hire back previous employees and provide full-time stable jobs. And for the most part, they had accepted them. We did lose several employees who, you know, moved back home, or, you know, who either weren't from this area or had trouble during the pandemic, you know, paying rent on a rather expensive cost of living city without a full-time occupation. So we did lose a few people that had moved out of state, as well as some people who took part-time jobs or full-time jobs elsewhere. We had a lot of our back of house team that had gone to work at Ingles and Harris Teeter and these grocery stores that were open. And many of them did come back, but there was a transition period for sure between the work that they did during the pandemic and then coming back to more of an a la minute line cook as opposed to prepping or working in a grocery store. Asheville has always been a very interesting market for hiring, particularly in the service industry. And I won't go into to all of the reasons why, but I think a lot of people have experienced this, particularly in southern cities, that, you know, the wages haven't yet caught up with the cost of living. We see that a lot. The living wage in Buncombe County, in our county, is $17. I think it's $17.20, which is a lot to get paid hourly. And that's for, you know, in order to be certified living wage, all of your employees have to make that. So that is, that's living wage in Buncombe County, which means that, you know, that's a deserved and certainly worthwhile pursuit. But that can also be a challenge, particularly as we have a lot of small businesses, or that there are differentiations of roles. And so hiring in Asheville has always been a balancing act between finding talented and experienced people, and being able to afford them. I think that a lot of restaurants have been, you know, trying to find that model. You know, Herre has certainly revolutionized the way that it pays its employees in terms of tip sharing and things like that. But until we do away with the tip credit, there's some wage disparity between front of house and back of house that we can't necessarily address. But so that hiring piece has always been a little bit of a challenge. The market in Asheville has always been a little bit of a challenge. There's a lot of competition for good employees because there are so many wonderful, amazing independent restaurants, which is one of the best things about Asheville. But it's definitely a challenge in a service-based economy or tourism-based economy to find a sustainable way to hire and have people who have housing, who can afford housing. So we do have some people who, you know, travel from Burnsville and from Weaverville and Waynesville and, you know, slightly further out. And then of course, lots of people who also live downtown or have found housing. I think that we have been very fortunate that many of our previous employees returned to work. So we were not pressed at any point in time for or desperate, or there wasn't a consuming need until the holidays, which always happens as a seasonal enterprise. So no, we have been able to hire everyone that we need, which has been great. But fortunately, it's in large part because we had a fairly large staff prior to COVID, and then we're able to invite most of those employees back. So even in the first year of the pandemic, as we're approaching about a 1 year mark, in just 2 weeks from today, it'll be 1 full year since they closed restaurants for takeout only. We've been able to offer an employment letter to all of our previous employees. Not all of them have returned, but I've only had to hire a few people for coverage, and then particularly as some people kept their jobs from the pandemic, they also changed their availability. So I've hired some people back based on just needing a day covered. Sundays, and if you know anyone who wants to work Sunday brunch, I'm always interested.
Okay.
Are y'all doing anything to help your employees regarding vaccinations? John has been very much an advocate of vaccinations. So he has, we just got so today officially marks the day where phase 3 employees, which includes restaurant workers, are eligible for vaccines. So that has started today, which is very exciting. So John is actually drafting a Dolce message now to make sure all of our employees are aware of that. And then we have paid for COVID testing throughout the pandemic. So employees just bring receipts and we will reimburse them for COVID tests. So we have not developed a plan yet for vaccinations. It wasn't supposed to start until the 10th for phase 3 for restaurant workers. And they moved it up by a week, which is wonderful. But we do not have a specific, financial assistance plan yet. But John is very much an advocate for the vaccinations and has disseminated information as it becomes available.
I have a question, Chelsea.
Absolutely.
Jamie, regarding vaccinations, what do you have, and you may not have a plan yet, but in regards to employees that want to be vaccinated, and then there are going to be employees that don't want to be vaccinated. Do you have any suggestions, or how will you handle that?
I do. So this is something we've thought about a lot because, and in particular, and not just in regards to vaccinations, but also in regards to, temperature checks and things about whether we require them of guests or just of employees. And to date, we have required them only of our employees. Again, mostly in the vein of if they are safe and wearing masks. And we have been, if you look at the reviews of Rhubarb, there are plenty of people who say that we take the masks too seriously, which I would beg to differ. But we rely on our management team to enforce our rules for guests. We have a printed out sheet that says what our expectations of our guests are and that kind of thing. But we've chosen not to temperature check our guests. So as of now, vaccinations aren't something we would require for guests. So we haven't gotten to the point where they're required for employees, particularly because they've just become available. And Kit also asks, do we see any hesitancy by our employees to get the vaccine? No one on our teams has been vocal about not wanting them yet. In fact, I've had several employees ask me about information. So we have, John literally emailed me 3 minutes ago, a draft of our communication to our employees about vaccines. And it just includes links to Walgreens, and places where you can get an appointment. So I think for us, it's mostly starting ground is that advocacy of making sure they have the information, the time off work, the financial ability to pay for it. So making sure that they're educated about their options. and starting from there. Particularly Governor Cooper, North Carolina, Buncombe County have not been shy or have been fairly, I don't know, is aggressive the right word? Fairly, I don't know. I feel like they're fairly stringent in terms of the requirements for masks and social distancing and those sorts of things. So I do feel fairly confident that as we continue to navigate the pandemic, that we'll continue to enforce those policies and make sure that we do our best to protect them from the things that we do know work and have certainly within our staff reduced exposure and contraction of cases. Social distancing, wearing masks, limiting the amount of people in any area, sanitation, symptom checks, temperature checks. But yes, I mean, John and I certainly believe in the vaccine and want to make that information available to our employees. I don't think we're quite to the point yet of requiring them.
I have one more question for you, Chelsea. It's Amy again. You were talking about how there's better communication. This has brought better communication between leadership staff and line staff, if you will. I mean, I'm sure there have been suggestions made by line staff to the leadership team. Can you tell us any of those suggestions because as a leadership team person and a line staff team person, there can be things that are missed. You think one way with a leadership hat and another way with a line staff hat. So Absolutely. Can you give us any of the suggestions or things that may have come about that others could take advantage of?
Certainly. I think the first thing that our staff sort of, other than just the general initial, conversation of, is it safe to come back to work question. We had a team meeting. We did a reorientation as we re-onboarded people to show them we had gotten a different disinfectant, just kind of show them the processes that we had put in place, because we did have staff working from March through May. It was just the leadership team, but we are still humans with droplets to be spread and received. So we did sort of share our processes and do a reorientation in that. And in that first initial meeting with our team, we saw a lot of good feedback. So the first was that we originally, the Count on Me NC program has it was sort of divided into roles. So there was like a customer facing one, and then there was one for leadership or owners and managers. Mm-hmm. And the first piece of feedback that we had was actually that people preferred to take the one for owners and managers as opposed to taking the one that was guest facing or for line staff. And mostly kind of what you said about that decision-making process. So I think a lot of our employees very much were invested in and interested in how we were making these decisions and what information were we considering when we were making these policies. So that was sort of the first piece of feedback, was that they wanted the same information that we had. So they all took the owners and managers as opposed to the hourly worker. I think it's divided into front of house or customer service, I think is one of them. The other was the bathrooms. That was because that's just a place where that's already sort of, dirty, if you will, or that germs appear. And so there was some concern about cleaning them, and that they, wanted to make sure that there was a viral disinfectant as well as, the normal toilet scrub brush. So that was something we took into effect. So that was when EnviroMasters came, and they actually have it looks like an air freshener, but it's not. It's actually like an aerosol, like viral spray. So we installed those. The other, a lot of it was mostly just with their guests. For us, was in terms of, because there is a delicate balance, I think, in particularly for customer service or people who are guest facing, and a certain amount of pressure for that customer is always right mentality. There's also just dealing, how do we as a company, and how do we expect them as an hourly person whose job is to be accommodating and welcoming and helpful, deal with people who aren't interested in the precautions that we're taking or the mandates that we're required to operate under, or any of those things, you know, that we do to protect ourselves, our business, and our staff. And so that was a lot of the good conversations that we had were about that, and sort of putting that onus of responsibility on our leadership team to correct behavior of the people that our employees came in contact with. That, you know, it wasn't, and well, certainly some of our, you know, many of our employees certainly feel their own agency in terms of advocating for, you know, stepping away from a table if a guests don't have masks on, or asking them to do it while they're cashing out the table, because there is more, you know, a closer interaction. And we certainly encourage them to have their own agency and stick up for themselves, but that obviously, when there are tips and gratuities involved, that there can be some pushback and not wanting to, you know, argue with someone about policies. So that was a lot of the good conversations that we've had have really been about how do we deal with people who don't want to follow those rules. And I think, again, the biggest takeaway for us has been that's leadership's responsibility, and not that we try not to police people, you know, as an aspect of our role. But that was part of how we developed our it's what we call our COVID covenant. And it says, you know, these are the things that we're doing to keep you safe, and here are expectations while you're visiting with us. Which includes, you know, wearing your mask when you're not actively eating and drinking, washing your hands, we put up extra hand sanitizing stations throughout the restaurant, utilizing those, and not coming in if they have any symptoms, you know, things like that. But so for us, it's mostly been, and I you know, there certainly have been some people who are resistant. But at the end of that COVID covenant, it says, if you have any questions about our policies, please ask a member of our management staff. And we did put that management piece of it in there very purposefully to make sure that ownership responsibility is on our leadership team to enforce policies, as opposed to putting it on our hourly workers, in particular, our hourly workers who are dependent on tips, to make that their responsibility to police or to, you know, feel challenged by that. So I think that was really good. And then I'd say the last sort of piece of it was when we did have people who were out of work or missed a shift due to symptoms, and while we were awaiting testing. So that has been a big challenge for the business. I mean, one of our biggest challenges, I think, is that communication piece, and finding that right balance between protecting the privacy and respecting, you know, the boundaries of it being a health issue of our employees, but also, you know, understanding that if there is a positive test, doing contact tracing and making sure that we are doing the responsible thing for isolating and quarantining cases. So I think that was the other, you know, when an employee misses a shift, I would say most of our staff in the beginning would say, why? Where is so-and-so? What happened? You know, and there was a lot more fear or concern or anxiety regarding other people not being at work and worried that it was due to being COVID positive. And so, like, I know I'm hitting the communication hi-hat real hard, but that really, I feel like, has been both the biggest struggle and the biggest boon to our business, has just been trying to be transparent and trying to open those lines of communication, so that the employees don't feel like they have to ask those questions. So that's probably the biggest thing that I would encourage people to do, is to take those steps in having that proactive communication. And that doesn't mean saying, you know, oh, so-and-so isn't here because they have a fever. Not necessarily, but but understanding how much to be transparent about, and that if you do have people who are awaiting tests, being in contact with your staff and saying, we will let you know as soon as we know more. That it's okay not to have all of the answers, but it's not okay to withhold information that people deem vital to their health. So I think that's been the big thing that we've kind of seen, is that and that we have been fortunately able to alleviate some of that anxiety. So now if someone isn't at work, I don't have as many questions about why or what's happening, because I think there is more confidence in our team that the important information, or the information that affects them, will be communicated to them. So I think establishing that trust and reinforcing it at every turn is really worthwhile.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Are there any other questions? No other questions. I'm going to talk about the chat. Jared Perkins from First Bank, I see, put in that he would love to talk to you about basic finance questions. They do not need to be a bank customer. He's not going to sales pitch you, but he's just got the experience, and will help you out if you want to chat with him.
Hi, Jared.
Yeah. So Chelsea, that was great information. I liked how you took us through the story of how it worked and how you got to be where you are now, and things are actually falling into place better. You feel better. Your staff feels better. It's going to work. We're all going to make it out. Thank you for being here. It's really
Absolutely.
nice to have you. And Nancy, thank you for Mission. Again, thank you for being a sponsor for us. We are completely appreciative. We love your partnership. And Crystal, to you as well. Thank you for the Diversity Engagement Coalition, partnering with the Chamber on this SMART series. Awesome. Okay, we're right at the hour, so I am grateful to have you all. Thank you. I hope you enjoy. The sun is shining. If you can, go get some vitamin D. It's my favorite thing. Take care.
Good for your health.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.